Greetings, my good people. This is Dr. Jenn. I am the CEO and founder of Decolonizing Therapy. I'm also a Westernly trained clinical psychologist. I am a scholar activist. I have been studying trauma in some way, shape, or form, and the ways that we can bring healing to our lives, our trauma stories, as well as find liberation in our trauma stories for the last 20 to 25 years. I'm also a spiritualist, a health worker, a healer of sorts, and a mental health paradigm shifter. Part of my work has consistently been helping people, places, spaces, and communities not only just understand and acknowledge various forms of trauma, but really helping our communities work with, undoing, and understanding the impact and effects of colonization as an original attachment and soul wound in the lives, bodies, and spirits of colonized people. And so today, why this is so important and why I bring up the colonial wound is because rage and grief and shame, but in particular rage, often comes from this colonial wound, right? Rage is super understandable. So today we're going to talk a little bit about rage as teacher, right? As sacred teacher. Now, why this is so important is because so often when we think about rage, we're thinking of someone, usually a person of color, let me add, usually a larger, darker skin or mentally ill person of color that immediately elicits this feeling of, ooh, unsafe, too much. For others of you, you might immediately move to an image of individuals protesting. And what I think is so fascinating about this is that we don't often think about why people experience rage. I believe that oftentimes we're running to this place and space where we're thinking of rage simply as something that is shameful, that is bad, quote unquote, that is unsavory, that is embarrassing. And the reality is, rage can be a sacred teacher, right? Rage, when we play with the energy and bring in the energy of reverence, respect, and energetic alignment with it, we can begin to notice how our rage can teach us not only something about ourselves, but about our ancestry, about the people that have supported us or raised us, cared for us, as well as what that meant for our lineage and our people. And so when I think of rage as teacher, I'm really reminded of a quote by ancestor James Baldwin. To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. I'd like for you to sit with that for a second. I'd like for us to take a moment to think about why, right, Black folks in what is now known as the United States might be feeling, or folks that are identified as Black, whether or not folks identify as such, right, is a whole other conversation for another time. But I'd like for us to think for a second about what it means to feel a sense of rage. Well, number one, anger and rage are not the same, and I say that with a lot of love. Anger, on one end, is often quite understandable. It brings along a sense of, you've cut me off, I'm frustrated, this isn't fair, it's indignant. It's usually quick, fast, but after maybe an hour, half an hour, a day, you're able to move on from it. There's usually not a physiological, quote unquote, hangover or side effect. Rage, on the other hand, is primal, like big jaguar cat or leopard. I want you to think of bear, right? I want you to think of an energy that is there's a grumble from the pit of its stomach. I'd like for you to think about how rage is not just often warranted, like when our boundaries are crossed, when someone gets too close to us and we step back. That's not necessarily rage either. But that's when rage begins. We can start to feel the beginnings of rage when little by little, aspects or part of our dignity have been overridden, when consent is not always asked for or acknowledged, or when we notice a consistent theme across how we, our family, and or our culture and community, including our ancestral lineage, including how we might identify racially, including how whether or not we identify as a person living with visible or invisible disabilities, including whether or not we're identifying another person being harmed that are living with very similar mental health diseases or issues as we are. When we see someone that mirrors our own identities and pain, and they're being violated, harmed, killed, ignored, it is understandable for a sense of frustration and rage to begin to erupt, much like a volcano, right? Erupts within us and out of us. And so the thing about rage, again, different than anger, is that it creates this sort of mind-body disconnection. My rage teacher, Ruth King, and writer of Healing Rage, Women Making Inner Peace Possible, talked a lot about this rage and shame connection. She often identified this like split. And the thing is that oftentimes when we think of rage, we're just thinking of ourselves, but I'm inviting us to not only see rage as a teacher, but to see our rage as an inheritance, right? Some of it is truly this intergenerational trauma flood, this epigenetic process, this role modeling process, right? Because trauma is handed down and passed down directly and indirectly, right? So that means biologically, as well as non-biologically, through role modeling, through having grown up with people, places, cultures, and systems. And always within the frame of decolonizing therapy, the invitation is for us to take a step back from immediately pathologizing, immediately identifying what the problem is, and to, take a step back and instead think, where do I feel this in my body? Is my thinking foggy? Do I feel a deep hunger in my stomach? Do I feel nauseous? Is my throat constricting? This is all information. Often we aim to have a consciousness around our feelings, particularly around an emotion as large and spacious as rage. So this is where that rage that feels uncontrollable, that feels scary, that we also often think of where someone may have harmed us in their rage, or maybe they were drinking or using substances during their rage. That's not the kind of rage I want to invite in. I'm inviting you in, and I'm inviting this rage in, where we start to understand that there's cause and effect. But for now, allow me to say that it is your birthright to be enraged and enraged. And it is sometimes important to notice that rage and shame are often mistaken for each other. You know, if I'm feeling really overwhelmed, I'm feeling that I have a million tasks on my plate, I'm also maybe feeling like I'm not giving myself space or time to eat or to be in joy or to have some fun or to take a day off without thinking about tasks or work or deadlines. After a while, that may start to impact my safety. That might start to feel like, oh wait, am I getting closer to burnout or whatever I perceive as burnout all over again? So you see, what starts to happen is I might feel, a sense of rage, but I'm not allowing myself to get to the root of why. And the why may be a frustration at feeling as though I am overworking, undercompensated, undersupported, and feeling as though, wait, I've been here before. That oftentimes that rage is this teacher when we see it, honor it, and hold space for it like a sacred tool, right? A sacred tool to help us continue to unpack, pivot, unlearn, relearn, and truly understand what it means to divest from colonial ways of understanding our big emotions like rage, right? So that's part of the decolonizing of our lives, and why I talk about decolonizing therapy, because this is a way that we can use rage as ancestral guidance and ancestral wisdom. We want to make space for it, not obliterate it, right? Not push it under the rug. And so I'd like for us to then shift into rage as a communicator and rage as a sacred communicator, right? And rage as a sacred communicator, meaning that oftentimes our rage comes about in ways, places, spaces, and forms that are often most unlikely, that often make us feel like, whoa, I did not expect that to come out. I didn't expect to get so enraged when this person said this in this classroom or in this space. Why am I shaking? Why am I suddenly sweating? Or why am I brought back to my belittling caretaker screaming at me outside of school with all my friends and people looking on and laughing, right? So again, remember, systems, structures, and white supremacy will have us thinking that inhibiting and closing down our rage is healthy, is quote unquote couth or respectful, or the ways to handle things. It is professional, air quotes. Remember that that is part of the ways that coloniality and white-bodied supremacy has projected onto us what is appropriate, what is humane, what is animalistic, and how we should behave. And so rage as communicator doesn't mean that we just get to pop off on someone, start screaming in their face, disrespecting them, mushing them, or giving them the cold shoulder, ignoring them. That's also a form of rage, right? We're just shutting down and expecting people to come and take care of us because we want their attention. That's another form of rage and a form of passive aggressiveness. But no, rather, I'm inviting us to look at rage as a way of saying, hey, I'm starting to feel this. This is the third time this week that I felt like I wanted to cuss someone out in the most inappropriate way, in the most inappropriate place, space, and time. Rage often starts out, like I said, like a volcano. There might be underground seismic activity, and you are the seismologist. Is that even a word, right? Like, you are the scientist. You are the social scientist of your dang self. Not that you can have some other quote unquote professional come along and tell you how to do it and tell you what is dangerous and what is not and what's a problem in you and what needs to be fixed for your entire dang life. Nope. Contrary to popular belief, part of why I do what I do is to start teaching you some of those tools, techniques, kind of signs, beige flags, right? Is that what we're saying these days? Before they become red flags. Now, let me just say, I love me some red. Okay. So we need to undo this understanding that red is just seeing rage and bad, right? Again, down with the binaries. They are so boring and they are so dang vanilla and they are so colonial. Instead, rage as communicator helps us see what are some of the signs, expressions, aka symptoms that are showing up that lets us know, ooh, I might need to take care of my rage inheritance or my rage child or my rage adolescent at this time. What can I do to take this steaming rage and turn it into sacred rage? 2, right? How do I honor it? And we can talk about that in the whole energetics of rage workshop. We can talk about this in full at another time. But instead of just oh, yep, I'm feeling anger, I'm feeling rage. How do we start to honor rage, right? Because if it doesn't go somewhere in our lives, it will surely come out and pop out of us in ways that don't always feel sacred, that don't feel good, and that then will elicit a great deal of shame later on. I also would be remiss if I didn't note how whiteness, right, and white supremacy pathologizes rage, right? And so if you have followed me and if you're watching this, you probably know and understand that I am the founder, the CEO of Decolonizing Therapy. And part of what I talk about, and part of what I talk about in my book, Decolonizing Therapy, Oppression, Historical Trauma, and Politicizing Your Practice, is how the mental health industrial complex, right? How mental health as a business model, and hunty, it so is, right? How it pathologizes and medicalizes spiritual and emotional, quite normal, as well as extreme expressions or diseases, which then creates further shame, discomfort, confusion, sometimes trauma for a person experiencing emotions that they feel like they can't understand, they can't unravel, they can't grasp, and they can't heal and work through. And so the mental health industrial complex frequently asks us to treat these spiritual and emotional and often embodied diseases. And I call them this because I don't believe that they're a disease, right? I don't believe that they are a problem. I don't believe that you're a problem. It is my very core belief of being a practitioner and being trained as a clinical psychologist, as well as someone working with individuals in a more spiritual realm, right? That a lot of people's big emotions and emotions that make us feel like we're drowning. And let's make no mistake, you're feeling what you feel, and that's on 100. That's real. That's valid. But they are related to and outcomes of, my good people, right? These big emotions, this depression, this deep anxiety, these panic attacks, feelings of being outside of your body, feelings that you're watching your body, dissociations, right? And all these other forms and pathologies and terminologies, that they are outcomes and responses to violence in and around our lives, including structural violence, including racism, including transphobia, including ableism, right, which comes out of the eugenics movement, right, including forms of heterosexuality, right, patriarchy. We could keep going on and on and on. And certainly, and at its crux, living in states of poverty, right? And so there are lots of reasons why many of us are feeling deeply, deeply sad, overwhelmed, out of our mind, out of our bodies. And so I just want to remind us, as we're talking about rage as sacred boundary, that there are systemic factors and reasons, as well as ancestral historical ones, that many of us today feel as though we're all struggling with different forms of diseases, and sometimes do need to find ways to medicate, whether we're self-medicating or whether we're, outsourcing and receiving medication in other ways. We cannot look at the field of mental health and the way that we provide provision of services without also looking at how historically anyone ever showing any outburst of emotion, being quote unquote passionate, a lot, overwhelmed, that those people are silenced, not just by the mental health industrial complex and psychiatry, psychology, medicine, but also how that goes hand in hand with the education system, and how there's a school to prison pipeline, or rather nexus, because it's not just a pipeline, it is a nexus, right? How particularly youth that are often having outbursts, not sitting in their seats, arguing, fighting, talking back, or too creative, too much, are often then penalized, given detention, kicked out of schools, seen as problematic, given a variety of diagnoses, heavily medicated, right? And definitely made to feel as if they are problematic. We see the same thing historically when we looked at hysteria and women-identified individuals, and good old Freud, right? Identifying these women as hysterical, when in reality, we can look at the histories and see how many of these women were in fact being abused. So I'm asking you to think about, how have you, family, loved ones, people you care about, been gaslit and made to feel that you are the problem? Again, this is not to say that you are not living with problems, that you are not living with imbalances, that you are not living in a state of pain or depression or deep overwhelm, that you are not living in a place or state of poverty. And let me just also point out that this is not per se your fault, right? I'm not telling you that you've created this in some way, shape, or form. I'm inviting us to think about the root of the issue. I'm inviting us to think about how systems and structures have continued to give us very little, to not have enough access to adequate therapy that allows us to feel safe, seen, and heard. Whether we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, whether we're talking about the Rwandan genocide, whether we're talking about Armenian genocide, whether we're talking about the violence of our Native and First Nations, Indians, residential schools, whether we're talking about the food crisis, right? Whether we're talking about lack of clean running water in what is known as the United States and Flint, Michigan, and many other places across the world and across the states. No matter what it is we're talking about, there's a sense of coloniality that still plays out and takes in the background. So how have you been gaslit and made to feel that you are the problem? How have you internalized this? How is this internalization, right, of your quote unquote badness or bad parts created more pain and more problems? And so again, this is an invitation to understand that they want to make you feel as though your sacred rage is a problem to be solved, that you need to go to anger management, that you are not lovable, that you're just angry. And instead, I'm inviting you to think about all the ways that you deserve to express yourself, that you deserve to say what doesn't feel good and what doesn't resonate. And you deserve to say no, no more, F no. Me, my family, my people, my kin, those of us living under this oppressed state no longer have to deal with this. So thank you for joining us. Again, this is Dr. Jenn, lovingly known as the Rage Doctor. Thank you so much for this time. Thank you for listening. And don't forget to like and subscribe. We have so much more in the works in the background coming down the river. We're going to drop our socials below. Feel free to pre-order my book, Decolonizing Therapy, Oppression, Historical Trauma, and Politicizing Your Practice. It's dropping November 2023, being published with W.W. Norton. At the end of July, I'll be providing an Energetics of Rage webinar. Please check out my link tree for more. That information will also be dropped below. Hope to see you there. And when in doubt, subscribe to our newsletter at www.decolonizingtherapy.com. Thank you so much, my good people. Please make sure you take care of yourselves, drink some water, stretch, and take a few deep breaths. You are amazing. You are badass. You are worthy, and you deserve to unhinge and pull the claws of colonial conditioning out from across your throat, your heart, and your whole body. Feel free to move. Feel free to feel well, and feel free to let out a and allow your sacred rage to be embodied within you today. Thank you so much.